You may notice that Alex isn't in the show today. This is because she is at home recovering from successful breast cancer surgery. But as they say in show business, the show must go on. And she wishes us all the very best.
Today on the Quilt Show, the Stash Bandit. And she's here with her scrappy quilts. We're going to explore contrast, cohesion, and obsession. Up next on the Quilt Show, you won't want to miss this showdown.
And now, your hosts for the Quilt Show, Alex Anderson and Ricky Timms.
Welcome to the Quilt Show, everyone. Today we have the Stash Bandit on the Quilt Show. That's right. Stick 'em up because she might actually steal your stash because she loves to work with scraps. Welcome to the Quilt Show, Diane Harris. Diane, it's so good to have you.
Thank you, Ricky. I'm so happy to be here.
Did I do a good job? Is that right? You're
You
the
did.
Stash Bandit?
You did. You
All
did
right.
great.
Yeah, I'm supposed to be going pew, pew, like you're after us. Stick 'em up. So you really do love to work with scraps. I know that's the whole show today is going to be about that. But how did that love affair with scrappy quilts happen?
A couple of things. One was that I went to work for Quilt Maker magazine. It was my first job in the industry. And all of the fabric companies would send us samples of their latest lines. And the fabric would build up so much over the months that we would have a grab a couple times a year.
Oh, well, okay, before you go to the grab, I want to give
Yes.
a visual, okay?
Sure.
Because we've got several of the Quilt Maker magazines. So you were working for the magazine as an editor, a pattern writer, or all that kind of stuff?
I did patterns and I wrote product reviews.
And people may not know that this is kind of what happens at those sales tables for fabric lines is they give little swatches of the fabric, right?
Sure.
And what you're saying is these came to you?
Right, so the fabric manufacturers would send samples of all their latest lines to the magazine because, as you can imagine, it's very valuable for them to have their fabric in the pages. So once the fabric is outdated, that there's not really a use
3
for
months
that.
old?
Yes.
Yeah.
So in the end, staff members would take those waterfall cards home. And so twice a year, I would take home a huge car full of fabric.
Oh my word.
So my stash grew.
So when you said people were grabbing though, was it like free for all, go to a table, it's all there? Or how did you fight over it?
We didn't fight. There was plenty for everybody. Yeah, usually it was all piled on a couple of huge tables, and the staff just set aside a morning when we would go in, and you could just take what you wanted. And I ended up taking things that weren't necessarily what I thought was my style or my taste. But later that turned out to be such a good thing because then I had to figure out how to use those fabrics.
Right.
So I ended up with hundreds of samples of fabric in all different genres. And that's one of the reasons I started making scrappy quilts.
Built your stash. Let's look at some of your quilts, okay?
Sure.
Because they're going to be scrappy. So let's talk about this one.
This is called 9-Patch Jambalaya, and it started when a little bee that I was in exchanged small 9 patches for a year. And so I had about 225 9 patches, and they were everything. Batiks and 30s and Christmas and really bad quality fabric. I mean, everything. And I couldn't imagine how I was going to make them work together. But I had seen the idea of disappearing 9-patch. So I took a breath and started cutting them apart. You know, you cut them vertically and horizontally, and then you sew them all back together randomly. And because they're so tiny, it sort of started to work. And the lesson I learned on this quilt is that if patchwork is pretty small, you can use all the genres together.
Okay.
You don't really have to have glue to hold it together.
And glue, by glue, you mean a common denominator of some kind,
Exactly.
right? Let's look at this next one. Tell us about this.
This is Rainbow Dacious, and when I was first working for Quiltmaker, I had been a stay-at-home mom for 20 years, and so having a full-time job was a big adjustment, and I wasn't having any time to sew. And I loved the job, but I was very unhappy about not being able to sew. So I, in desperation, cut up some scraps into these little bricks, 1.5 by 2.5, because I had a sense you could make some kind of a little windmill thing. And I would just keep those patches by my machine, so in the evening I could mindlessly make those little blocks. So this quilt grew out of that little block.
I love it. You're from Nebraska.
Yes.
Right? And I think of Nebraska, first of all, there's wonderful quilting going on in Nebraska. It has a huge tradition of quilting, but a lot of it would be related to scrap type quilts, making do, using what you have. And so you really feed into that a little bit. How long have you been quilting?
For about 39 years.
Wow.
I was expecting my first child when I took my first quilting class.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And then, so what was going on in your life maybe prior to that? What are your roots?
My roots are that I started to sew in Nebraska 4-H clubs when I was 8 years old. And my mom sewed, but I had a sister-in-law who really took me under her wing and mentored me with fabric and garment sewing, and I still pin the way she taught me to pin.
Okay.
Huge influence in my life.
That's great.
So I made garments for about 15 years, and then kind of stumbled onto quilting when I was married, expecting my first child.
Okay. Well, let's look at the next quilt, because one of the things that I want people to notice in your quilts, that we're going to call them scrappy quilts, okay?
Mm-hmm.
But they are, that doesn't mean that you just threw things up there. Everything is still planned, and you're going to teach us today how to make sense out of those scraps, right? Tell us about this quilt.
This is called Cope and Hope, and it's a quilt that grew out of the pandemic. As we were in lockdown, I was thinking about quilters at home, making things, and for me, quilting was very comforting during that time. It was familiar and repetitive, and I knew other quilters felt the same way. So the blocks represent city blocks or country miles, and then at the center of each is a different little miniature block to sort of suggest the idea of what people were making.
That's great. And the next quilt?
This is called Big Cheese. And it's named so
What a
because
great name.
of the cheddar colored fabric,
Yeah, sure.
right? And this started out, it was another idea that completely flopped. And I had some of those failed patches or units up on my design wall, and I could kind of start to see columns emerge.
Sure.
And so I latched onto that column idea and changed the plan completely, and this is the quilt that...
That's fabulous. All right, we're going to look at the next one. Tell us about this one.
One of the things I love to do is to take someone else's rejects and see what I can do with them.
Wow.
So on a giveaway table, there were 3 quilt blocks. One is the Christmas tree at the top, and then the joy block, and then the candlestick on the left. They were somebody else's throwaways. And so I took them home, and I thought for a couple years, and then I just decided to do an improvisational sampler. And samplers are a huge passion for me.
Okay.
And if you combine that with improvisation, it just doesn't get any more fun.
I know, I agree, and I have had those blocks, and sometimes they sit around for a while, and I'm grateful that I had the growing experience before I actually used them in a quilt. Has that experience happened to you?
Yes, absolutely.
That's awesome.
Sometimes your first idea flops, and it can be some time before an idea will work with something.
Now, there's a story associated with Quilt Nebraska, which I got to do many years ago, and I have a story too, but we're not going to hear mine. I want to hear yours.
Well, I was teaching at Quilt Nebraska one year, and there was an exhibit of teachers' quilts hanging. So I walked into that area, and there was my very humble, simple little Dresden plate quilt hanging next to a Sharon Chamber quilt, her famous red quilt.
Right.
And I just died 1,000 deaths. I had every emotion possible because I felt elated.
Right, that it was close by.
Yeah.
And probably horrified because it was nowhere close to that caliber, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
All those things. But over time, I thought about that a lot, and I realized that those two kinds of quilts both inspire people, but in different ways.
They do.
Most people don't see a Sharon Chamber quilt or a Ricky Timms quilt and say, oh, I could do that.
Mm-hmm.
They're
Yeah,
inspired in a different way.
I agree.
But when people see my quilts, a lot of times they'll say, I could do that.
It's all available for all of us, and we get to find our voice. And I don't care if it's a utility quilt for a child that's horribly pieced and tied with polyester yarn, or if it is the best of show quilt, they both have a place.
Exactly.
At least in our world, they do.
They do.
This next quilt, I want to show this because this is on the front cover of American Patchwork and Quilting. So this is pretty exciting all the way around. Tell us about the quilt.
This is called Star Silhouettes, and it came out of a playtime. During the first months of the pandemic, I hosted a little online event for quilters to just come and hang out for an hour on Sunday afternoons. And I made it complimentary, and it filled up quickly, and I realized then that they were expecting content, and I better get busy. So I started to play with different things, ideas I could share with them about scraps, and that little quarter star unit is one of the things I played with.
That's fabulous.
And I call it a star quar because it's just 1/4 of a
Okay.
basic star block. And then I decided I wanted to take that idea and go further with it. So this is one of the quilts that I designed. It's just little quarter stars. There's
I love it.
nothing to it.
I love it. It's happy. And one of the things you're going to teach us today is how really, because scrap quilts can't just be thrown together. There is logic behind it, and that's what we're going to do to get it cohesive and make it make sense with contrast in the next section, right?
That's
Now,
right.
you're not going to come to my house and steal my fabrics, you Stash Bandit, right?
No, I won't.
Well, if you do, we're going to have a good cup of tea and visit a little bit.
That sounds
And I
great.
hope you'll have a cup of tea and continue to visit with us, because up next we're going to learn how to use contrast with scrappy quilts. Welcome back, everyone. We're here today with Diane Harris, and she is going to steal your heart and teach you how to use contrast in those scrap quilts, right?
That's right.
Okay, so let's talk about contrast. Just what is it? I know that there's words in the world of art, contrast, value, and so forth. So we're going to try to do a little definition and get some visual examples.
Exactly. Contrast is really just the difference between things. You don't have to make it any more complicated than that. Values are, if you think about fabric, value is just the lightness or darkness of a fabric compared to its neighbors.
And that's important because there's a relationship involved in value. I mean, yes, you can say this is, let's just look, this is a medium value. We could say that, but next to this is light.
Yes.
But next to this is darker.
Exactly.
So even though it is medium, it does have to do with the relationship.
Yes. So value and contrast work hand in hand, kind of like Reese's peanut butter cups, where you have chocolate and peanut butter, and they're different things, but they're working together.
Yeah.
That's how value and contrast are. So I wanted to show you a little bit about how contrast can work in a quilt block with fabric. And so we're going to start with a block that's really low contrast. This is a very simple block, but it's made of half square triangles, and it's a nice way to demonstrate this idea.
Okay, and I just want to say that on the paper here, this is kind of what we're striving for. Is that the idea that this is relatively dark?
Yes.
And then we have the medium and the lights. That's
Yes.
kind of where we're headed.
Right, so you could put the darker fabric here if you wanted, but we just colored them differently here so you could get an idea of how the different values could work. Yeah, let's go to the
Okay,
fabric.
all right, so let's go to fabric. So this is the same pattern, same
This is
design.
the same block, and in this one, there really isn't much contrast at all. You can't really see that design popping out at you.
It's like a mystery.
It's kind of a bad mystery, not working so well. Contrast is what makes a design visible, and if you don't have enough contrast, the design doesn't show up.
Okay.
So this next block,
It's a little better.
a little better. You can see it a little more, but this is a good place to say you can't ever make your decisions about value and contrast from this distance. You really need to put it up on a design wall and stand back.
I'm with you, sister. Okay, because here's one thing, but well, even at a quilt show, you don't walk right up to the quilt. You're seeing it from a distance.
Exactly. No one is ever going to look at your quilt from here first. And if your quilt's dynamite, they might come in for a closer look. But this is not real life. This doesn't actually give you a perspective of what's happening.
So here's my comment, because I'm the guy that likes to find positive. Okay. I think that the diamond has stuck out a little bit, but even though these are all kind of reddy or pinky, I think they're the ones that are still feeling a little bit lost on
Yes.
this for me.
Agreed.
Okay.
So this next one, I tried to solve that problem a little bit by using the same fabric in all four corners so that the pink red kind of pops out a little bit more. And so this is one that would probably work okay in the bigger picture of the quilt. And from a distance, you could probably see that design pretty easily.
Okay, very good. Next one?
The next one, I tried to make it a little higher in contrast, but I sort of
I'm
failed.
going to put these side by side now so that we can see this is where we're at now.
Yes. So when I got this one all made, I realized, oh, I didn't do such a great job. And as I looked at it, I realized the problems that sometimes you run into. If you have a fabric where this area is quite a bit darker than this area on the fabric,
Okay.
sometimes that can kind of mess up the eye. So if you were to substitute something a little higher in contrast, that would help.
All right. Now I'm going to do A and B.
Sure.
So there's nothing really horrible about that, but I can see that there's a little bit of dark versus light. So you could just say, I'm going to take care of it by
Sure.
changing that patch.
And also sometimes when you get to this point, it's a little bit a matter of what you like, what your tastes are. Some people like less contrast,
Sure.
more blendy things.
And I'm kind of wishing that one might get a little different.
Yes.
And I mean, honestly, because of what you're teaching me, I kind of want to change out this guy on
Yes.
the corner, but we don't have a pink one, so I can't do that
We don't
today,
have a
okay?
pink one, but you get the idea.
Yeah, sure.
Those are some of the problem areas you can run into. So
right.
then this last block is pretty high in contrast, so it's pretty evident what the design of the block is.
And would you say this is too much, or is there such thing?
Well, there isn't such a thing as too much, but there is such a thing as dull. One of the reasons I love scrappy blocks is because they're a little more interesting than a block where everything is exactly the same.
Yeah, sure. And I do too. I love seeing the visual variety that can be achieved, especially from scrap quilts.
Yes. So here's an interesting thing. I think you could make a dynamite quilt if you only thought about value and didn't think about color at all. But the opposite is not true. If you just thought about color and you didn't think at all about value, you probably couldn't make a dynamite quilt.
Which goes back to that saying we all know, color gets all the credit, but value does all the work. So, yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely. All right.
Yes.
So are we done for the
We
next
are.
part, okay?
I wanted to show you a quilt top that uses another little trick I'm fond of. Sometimes when I'm making something that's just supposed to, the whole design is based on contrast. These stars are supposed to pop off the background. I'll run into some fabrics that cause me problems, and I don't have enough contrast. So if we flip this over and look at the wrong side, you'll see quite a few fabrics where I have used the wrong side up.
All right, so yeah, so I believe we can see that. Let me find one. Let me go with, just for the sake of everything here, let's go with this one, all right?
Yes.
I'm going to take that fabric and I'm going to flip it over to the other side, and we're going to see it's really washed out.
It's just a sort of a muted version.
Same thing with this one.
These are the kinds of fabrics that tend to cause me problems. They have really dark areas and really light areas, and your eye isn't sure how to read that, and it ends up looking kind of splotchy.
You just stole twice the amount of fabric. You did.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because if you got a good side and other side, that sounds so judgmental, doesn't it? Good side and bad side.
It's just
right
the back
side and wrong side.
It's just the back side.
Front side and back side. I'm okay with that.
Yes, and the quilt police, I'm living proof the quilt police are not going to come.
That's a great idea, and I think we all need to remember that the back side of our fabric can be very functional in a quilt.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Good opportunity to learn that.
So a lot of times people, they think that color is the most important thing, so they always want to know about color. Truthfully, I think contrast is about 90% responsible for the success of your quilt. But I thought we'd talk about color just a little bit. So here's an example of where all these reds are pretty much the same color of red. They're just different versions. So this is what you would call a matching.
It is very
set.
matchy, and for me, it's rather dull and drab.
Exactly.
I'm not trying to insult you.
No.
It just doesn't have a spark.
Exactly. So sometimes, you notice it's not sewn, it's just glued to the paper. And in class, I find that that's more useful because when I ask people to sew things together, it feels too permanent and they're hesitant. But if you give them a glue stick, then they have permission to play.
Yeah.
And that's what this
It's like
is.
second grade.
Exactly. So one thing you can do, you pull your matching fabrics, and then you can start by substituting just one thing with a little bit of clash.
Okay.
There's nothing as exciting as clashing. So we're going to replace these kind of that brownish red with something that clashes just a little bit.
Okay. Now, what do you mean by clashing? You think it's jarring, or it's more vibrant, or?
Yes.
Okay.
All of it.
Okay.
It can be a color, like if you're going to make a quilt with lots of different reds, all the reds work great together. We're going to put those, Ricky, here.
Okay, so we're just going to punch it up a little bit more.
We are, with a little more clash. I'm all about embracing the clash.
Okay.
Clashing is unexpected, and differences are always way more interesting than similarities. And
What
so
about these polka dots here?
those, I thought we'd punch up the corners a little bit.
All right, so
you can see this is pretty non-threatening, and it's just a little exercise that someone could do if they wanted to branch out from fabrics that were always matching.
all right, okay.
So then I thought, okay, let's do one more thing, and we're going to replace the grays with these golds.
Okay, all right, we can do that.
And I think that helps quite a lot. And you'll notice that there are different sizes of motifs. Here we have a tiny little calico. We have these more bold, stripy fabrics. So that's okay. I think that's better. But then I thought, okay, let's take it over the top. This is Stash Bandit style.
Okay.
What if we did electric yellow?
Yeah. And I will say that this yellow now becomes a dominant element in the quilt.
Well,
because it's like being a diamond, it's putting an impact of design in there.
yellow is a monster. It has a mind of its own. But see, to me, this is just so much more exciting than all the matching. Matching is for getting dressed, not for making a scrap quilt.
Which you look fabulous today, by the way, can I tell you. You have another way to do contrast here, and that
Yes.
is with these, the fabric squares. So talk to me about these.
Yes, so going back to contrast for just a second, these are some other ways. So here, I love this idea. This is a very modern fabric, and I've paired it with a 30s reproduction. And I have a whole collection of 30s that I'm not fond of anymore, and so I'm trying to put them with other interesting, unexpected things.
All right, very good. So we can take that one away.
Yep.
We'll see how many of these we can get through.
All right. This one is interesting because the difference in the lines of the fabric, very straight lines and very curvy lines and circles.
Sure.
That's a great way to add contrast.
And again, so you're using straight lines, curved lines, and that becomes something that's different, which
Yes.
creates interest and variety.
Difference is always more interesting than similarity. So this I love. I would do this in a heartbeat. Really muddy and gray, almost fluorescent. Very interesting dynamic in a quilt.
And so when we talk about color, there are muddy, drab colors, but there's also electric, vibrant colors. So that's another version of contrast.
Exactly. Here we have a form of contrast where it's a difference in sort of the mood of the print. So this is a real regular repetition, and this is real model-y and irregular.
Contrast.
Yep. And this last one I adore. The size of the motifs can be so exciting if you do. See how those little keys are fairly small, and then you have that giant plaid or gingham check. So there are lots of ways that you can add contrast besides value.
I want to talk about the color wheel and the color tool real quick as we get ready for break.
Sure. This is a tool that I got years ago, and I love it because what I learned from this little guy is that all of these different little swatches,
Variations, yep.
yes, they're variations of this color. So here's what this color does if you add white, here's what it does if you add black, and if you add gray, and so on. So it helped me understand what you said earlier about the different personalities of one color.
Sure, and that's what I do mean is that a lot of times we go, you need to use red in your quilt. Great, but you also have all of these variations of red that still are within the red.
Exactly.
And then for your fabrics selection, you've got an analogous selection. I love this opportunity where you choose colors that are kind of side by side on the color wheel, which is what you see there.
Yep.
And how do you create the pop? How do you create the contrast?
Well, you can create a little pop by going directly across from one of the colors here. And in this case, we kind of went directly across from the purpley pink here.
Right.
And you use this as your little zinger. So maybe some little cornerstones or some element in the quilt.
Now, for me, that would be proportionately smaller than all of the others. You just have those little pops of accent and they're across the color wheel.
That's exactly right.
Awesome. Well,
Yes.
when we come back, let's see, we've done contrast. Now what are we going to do? We're going to do cohesion. Cohesion. Yeah, I knew it had a C in it. Thank you for keeping me on track. And that's what we'll do right after the break. On the next Quilt Show, our guest, Vicki Connolly, spent 40 years as a professional potter before she discovered the joy of quilting. Her National Park Quilt series really put her on the map and firmly established her as a precision piecer with a lot to say. Vicki shows you how she pieces her graphic landscapes. Plus, the number one question she gets, how does she create the gradations in her sky? Well, she's giving you a private lesson right from the comfort of your home. Then, creativity enabler Carrie Bloomston drops by to share how making a soul box can spark your creative juices in more ways than one. 2 creative souls, 1 amazing show on the next Quilt Show. Welcome back, everyone. You know, the Lone Ranger wore a mask, right?
That's right.
And you are the masked bandit. You actually wore a mask before it was popular. Before the
did.
pandemic.
Yes, Stash Bandit was born a couple of years before the pandemic. So my little bandit mask has got a long history.
I'm curious, how did you even come up with that whole Mask Bandit thing? Because I think it's adorable.
I wanted something that was really playful and fun, and I wanted to communicate that a lot of times people can make amazing, beautiful scrappy quilts with the fabric they already own.
Wait a minute, that means you can't go buy more? Is that what you're
Oh
trying
gosh,
to say?
no.
No, we have to go buy more, always, right?
Always you can buy more.
All right, so in this segment, we're going to be talking about cohesion, right?
Yes.
We talked about things that made it contrasty before. Now we want to bring it together, right?
Exactly.
So we're going to do this by showing quilts.
Okay,
right? All
sounds
so
good.
I'm going to bring this one over and
Yes.
let you tell us all about it.
Sure. So cohesion is the idea of being unified. So you need to find a way to make all these diverse fabrics work together. And a one-color quilt is a very easy way to create cohesion. And red is the easiest one-color quilt to make. Mary Ellen Hopkins said all reds clash well, and she was absolutely right.
Now, why would red be the color to go to? And why not all blue or all green or all purple?
All reds, you cannot mess it up.
Okay.
You can't mess it up.
All right.
You use brick with hot pink, with fire engine red, with
And
salmon.
a brown red,
Yes.
and so forth, and salmon, like you said.
It all works. The other thing on this little quilt that helps tie it all together is the quilting. So very late in the process, I decided to treat the surface as just one thing. So I ignored the seam lines and just quilted the whole thing. And that adds to the cohesive element as well.
Sure. And before I leave monochromatic, I want to give a little nod to Alex, because Alex taught me that one of the best news about a monochromatic quilt is that it's all one color. And the worst thing about a monochromatic quilt is it's all one color.
Yeah.
So you're back to what you said in the last segment, contrast. You've got to have your lights, your darks, you've got to see the things, because if it was just all one general red, you wouldn't see hearts.
Right. So here's something to notice. Do you see how there's very little contrast between this pink and the background?
Yes.
But because the others are pretty high contrast, your eye fills that in. Your eye knows that that's a heart as well.
Yep.
So sometimes it's okay to have some things that are lower in contrast, as long as most of them show up nicely.
Then our brain fills in the gaps.
Exactly.
All right, so the next one, let me have you move that there, and I will bring this one over.
So here's another little one-color quilt, and again, boy, green is really fun to play with because you can pull out the olive greens and the grass green and the yellow green. But I think the biggest factor that helps this quilt is a neutral border, because it just sort of calms everything down. So a lot of times a border can be the thing that brings unity to the quilt.
And I told you that I might make my own comments.
Sure.
See, and if I don't quite get it right, you can let me know, okay? But I also think that this gray works because you've used the gray as little points of interest in here. They're background, but that's what helps. If those had been like yellow or something else, I'm not sure that the gray would have been the best choice here to float, but it really ties into those, and that brings cohesion to me.
Yes, I learned the hard way. You can't introduce a new concept this late in the process.
Right, absolutely. It's got to find its way from here out.
Exactly.
Okay, very
Yeah.
good.
Uh-huh.
And let's look at this one.
This little quilt feels cohesive to me because the fabrics have a certain mood, and they look a little bit 1940s or 1950s. Everything I chose, I wanted it to kind of continue to further that feeling or that mood.
But it does have chaos.
Oh, yes.
Because the fabrics are together, but there's chaos. But I love what you did to keep the chaos away.
Yes, and what would you say that is?
How you finished it. With the red.
Yes.
To kind of pull that all together and not let this chaos just keep flying. Yeah. And even though it doesn't have a large border, for me that's what I think, brings it together. What do you think?
I think you're right. That serves as like a little fence to corral
Good idea.
the whole
Yeah.
thing. Yes.
I like that, fence and corral, which reminds me you're from Nebraska. You're a farm girl.
Yes, I am. I guess that's why I use those words. I do live on a farm. I'm married to a farmer. And so we have corn and beans and wheat and mama cows.
And mama cows. Oh my gosh, any sheep?
No sheep.
No sheep, no goats?
No goats.
Chickens?
No.
No chickens. Everybody should have chickens. I wish I could have chickens.
Maybe once.
I like the way you said that. All right, let's talk about this.
This is a little quilt called Yule Glow, Y-U-L-E,
Oh.
for Christmas. And a couple things I think help. If you look at the light colored fabrics in the candlesticks, they're all very similar. And the idea of similar does a lot of heavy hitting in scrappy quilts, because if you put in something here that's much more medium or darker, it's going to interrupt the line.
It's going to cut right into that.
Exactly. So that similarity works well there.
Can I say, if you had opted to just make one piece of fabric here, I think it would have lost interest.
Yes. I
It
think
really would have lost interest. So the fact that there's a lot of different fabrics doing exactly the same thing is what makes it interesting to me.
yes, yes. Differences as far as the prints, that's always more interesting than similarity or just one fabric. I think you're right. And the thing that I think is the clincher for this quilt is that red border.
This,
If you took that off of this quilt, I don't think you'd ever glance at it twice. Somehow that, it's like a little bit of fire around, it's sort of an exclamation point, but it's also, again, it's that fence.
yeah, I think it also, kind of what the gray did, I think it helps these red bits make sense.
Yeah.
Because, I know I guess they're berries, it's leaves, it's hollies and berries, but this red really helps us see
Yes.
those other reds. Okay, very good, I love that. And coming to the next one, a little bit larger quilt here.
Yeah.
I love this. This is a fabulous sampler.
I'm a lover of samplers, and most of the time I use just one background fabric because it can be a little too much otherwise. On this one, again, I used similar grays for the background and limited the palette, but when I got the center done, I knew that it wasn't finished. It needed something else. And so I played with a bunch of ideas. Then I decided to kind of float the center with this narrow gray border. And then I knew exactly the purpley blue that I wanted for this. And I found it finally. But when I just sewed it on straight, it was still just dead. And so I decided to put that scallop in. And I think it really amps the quilt up a little bit. It makes it a better quilt.
For me, yes, the gray, having different grays, super, super great. I love that you floated it, which means, yes, you have a thin border, but it is your background fabric. It's not an accent fabric. I agree with the blue and the scallop. Like, you care that I agree. But the reason I do is because you've really tied the blue into the quilt with this. You've even tied these wonderful pops of pink with the binding. All of that really makes this work. And the other thing for me that makes this super cohesive is that the overall tonality of these colors, you don't have screaming yellow or super washed out red. They're all this kind of lovely, dusty, cohesive genre of color, and that brings all of that together for me as well.
And I wasn't always able to do that. I made a lot of mistakes in almost 40 years of quilting. So I have learned to make those decisions. I put it up on a design wall and I stand back and I live with it for a few days if I need to, because boy, it takes a lifetime to learn about some of these things.
Well, one more here. And this is really fun, bow ties.
I always wanted to make a scrappy little bow tie quilt. And, you know, if you make bow ties small, they're so adorable. So I made a bunch of scrappy bow ties and was playing with them, but it just looked like chaos. Nothing was really working. But then I thought of maybe if I grouped them by color. And when I did that, it started to make sense. It started to
So are you working on a design wall? I mean, you make your blocks and kind of push them up and move them around and that.
Yes.
I'm a big advocate for a design wall.
Yes, I design as I go. Like I just made blocks to start with. I never know at the beginning what it's going to look like. That's
Okay.
no fun.
All right, but you then made it cohesive. What did you do?
Well, I grouped these together and I decided that worked.
You
And
mean
then
grouping by color.
grouping by color.
So there's a green, there's a purple, there's a teal. Oh, but look at that one.
Yeah, you can
But
throw in
but
a...
my eye, see, my eye is pulling it all together, so it's the happy difference there for me.
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay.
And sometimes I throw in just a renegade. When we see this in vintage quilts, we think it's charming. So I don't know why we can't do it.
I agree 100%.
Then I felt like it still needed something else to tell the rainbow story. So I played with a bunch of different things and I ended up just bringing each color out into the piano key
Look at that.
border. So
That's fabulous.
that seemed to help.
Now, let's talk about it because it's the elephant in the room right now. We've talked about all the bow ties and they've been all coordinated and you brought everything out and then you went completely rogue with the stripe binding.
Yes, I have seen that kind of a binding on a lot of quilts that I thought were absolutely gorgeous. And so I thought maybe I'd give it a try.
But look at the it is fabulous on here.
Thank you.
And even though we said earlier, don't introduce something new out there, this is the perfect place to introduce something new. There's something about that black and white that turns gray in our eye that brings happiness to this entire quilt. I love that. It's one of my favorite things about the quilt.
Thank you. I feel like it's a nice little closure. It's a little period at the end.
That's great. Well, I think this is good lessons for all of us. I think, first of all and foremost, quilting is such a diverse art form. And I would say, if I was guessing, 80% or 90% of quilters are making quilts that are, you know, they're triangles, they're functional, and they're from standard patterns. And many times they are scraps, which is what you're using, but having the knowledge of where to contrast, how to bring cohesiveness, it's never just random. It's never just throw it there and make it happen. There's logic behind it. And what you've articulated so far today is something that we can take and chew on and really make our quilts better. I love it.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I hope
now,
so.
You like to take a block, okay, and then you obsess. And how can I do things differently? And I think all of us love to do that, and that's what we're going to do when we come back. We're going to get obsessed. We're going to probably even get arrested for going too far. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're having fun spending the day with Diane Harris. She is the Stash Bandit. And now we're going to do something that it seems all quilters do. Obsess. We find something, we love it, we just keep going and keep exploring the possibilities. And I love that. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, so when I went to work in the industry in 2005, I'd been a stay-at-home mom for 20 years, and I loved my industry job, but I was not having any time to sew, and I was very unhappy. So I started making these very simple little windmill blocks.
Let's look at those, all right?
Because I could just cut up some scraps. The patches are 1.5 by 2.5.
And let me just show it. It's basically this unit 4 times.
Yes.
So it's a 4-patch, but you've made a little 2-patch out of it. And give me the measurements because people will want to know.
Yes, 1.5 by 2.5.
All right, and then you sew those together, and that becomes what
A little unit.
Yeah, but what's the size
Oh,
of that?
that would be 2.5 inches square.
Okay, and finishes to 2?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
So the
that's
block finishes at 4.
Okay, perfect. All right, great, great.
And I just could mindlessly sew these in the evening when I was too tired to make any decisions. And that turned out to be really fun, but soon I had a few thousand of these.
And I'm assuming they were not all kind of blues and greens. They were all over the board with your scraps,
They
right?
were. The only thing you really have to think about is it's nice if most of your blocks have some contrast, so the little windmill shows up.
Okay, and in this case, or what I'm trying to observe, they're all four the same in that one block. So it's a two fabric block.
Yes.
Didn't have to be.
Exactly.
Right.
Sometimes if I didn't have 4 of these, I'd just substitute something kind of, sort of similar.
I don't
That's
know.
the beauty of
Some
Scrappy.
people just can't go there. You know that. All right. So let's look at this.
So one of the first things I decided to do was sort of limit the palette and pick blocks that were like this is a Christmassy color scheme. So I made a few little quilts kind of like this. Nothing super special, but a palette that is kind of happy and fun.
Okay. Now, in my fantasy right now, you've made a few thousand of these blocks. So you were able to literally just go in and go, well, I found some blue ones and some red ones, or some green ones and some red ones, and that's what I'm pulling from to then play with.
Yes.
So they're already kind of there. You didn't have to then start building the house again by making these blocks.
Correct. I think I probably made 5 or 6 more to kind of make it the size I wanted in the color scheme, but most of them were just
Already made.
happenstance.
And the other thing, we talked about this before, and I'm just kind of stopping preaching for a moment. When people have a block, a roadblock, I don't know what to make, I don't know what to do, I don't know what pattern to use next, or I'm not inspired, I've lost my muse. I mean, all of those things. My advice is to sew. Just sew. And this would be a block that you could just say, I'm going to make them over and over and over. And people sometimes go, well, I made 6 of these and I don't know what it's going to be. If you had 6 Legos, you couldn't make anything. But if you got 1,000 Legos, you can make anything. So that's my little sermon on this particular topic today.
Yes,
All right?
and that's kind of what happened in the quilt that's behind us. I was trying to figure out what to do with multicolored scrappy blocks, and I noticed on my design wall that a few darker ones were forming kind of a line. And I thought, you know, if I made darker ones on purpose, I could create almost like false borders. And so that's how that quilt came together. And I think those darker areas are what brings that quilt some unity.
It does, and back to cohesion, which we talked about, you've brought it together, and it's not a different pattern. It's the same block that you've made 1,000 times.
Yeah.
It's just the placement of everything in contrast.
Yes.
Because those were dark and the others were light.
Exactly.
All right?
So then I had this idea, maybe I could create enough quilts to do an entire trunk show that had quilts based on this little block or using it in some way. So I shrunk it way down. These finish at 2 inches. And so I used them kind of like Irish chain in this effect between those Dresden plates.
That's fun.
So I shrunk them, I made them huge, did lots of different interesting things.
You're
with them.
also doing what an artist really does, and an artist is always trying to answer the question, what would happen if?
Yes.
What if I try this? What if I do that? And you have to be willing to go down that path.
Yes.
Because you're not going to find out the answer otherwise.
Yes, and sometimes you have a few wrong answers.
And that's okay. You learn from that.
Exactly,
Yeah.
yes. So here I decided to group them, and a couple things that I learned, I needed to give some space. They needed breathing
To
space
float a bit.
around the group. And also at the beginning of this quilt, they were arranged randomly, but then it just wasn't coming together. So I had the thought of putting it like a checkerboard with red background, white background, and so on. And that helped it come together a little better.
Okay, and I just want to point out for somebody that might be going, what do I do? There's 4 of those blocks, okay, so that ends up being 1 block. You've put 4 identical together, and to give that floating, there's a side strip
Yes.
and a top and bottom strip. So that's
Exactly.
all that took. That's all that took to make that happen.
Yes, and here's a little secret. When you sew 4 together, you automatically get a magical freebie bonus one in the middle.
That's awesome. A little bit of Escher tessellation going on,
Exactly.
right? All right, so therein lies that particular obsession, but that's not the end of it because you decided I need to do some more.
I did. During the pandemic, I started to play with some different units, and this was one of the little units that I started to mess with. So it's just a fourth of a normal star block.
And you showed that in one of the quilts at the top of the show, right?
Yes. So I call this a star quar because it's a quarter of a star.
Star quar.
And again, I just made a ton of them. I have a Christmas quilt in the works, so a lot of these are for the Christmas quilt.
Yeah, I just pulled them out right there.
But some of them are just random.
Yeah, sure.
So again, I've been having so much fun with these and doing kind of a variety of things.
Now, I'm going to assume that through all of these, you ended up using the same, just for all of them, the same measurement. So all of your blocks are the same size.
They are, yes. And the other thing is when I make a scrap quilt, I don't want to fuss with cutting 10 different patch sizes. So I make each star quar from 6 2.5-inch squares. So 3 of this color and 3 of this color. I don't want, you have to cut quickly when you need 10,000 of something. And so one patch size is very conducive to that.
Okay. All right. Now, because I know I'm a little out of order, and that's okay, you guys, because our brains do go crazy every now and then. We forgot to mention the Christmas tree here on that first one. So let's look at it because I don't want to get too far away from it.
Sure.
So this is the same as we were doing earlier, right?
Right. So those are the little baby windmills. I had the idea that maybe I could do pictorial quilts with those little windmills. And this was my first attempt at a pictorial quilt. And the fun thing about this quilt is that except for the bows on top of the presents, there's only one patch size to cut for the entire quilt.
That's amazing.
And it's so much
fun. Yeah,
so
I can
entertaining.
see that. All right, sorry we forgot that, but we're back on track now, right?
Yes.
So what did you make?
So I obsessed with the little star quars. And the first thing I did was just to do a bunch of scrappy ones, and I thought I would try and pull it all together with some sashing. So I auditioned a ton of different fabrics, and where I landed was this polka dot.
I love that. It brings it together. It's unifying. We're back to that again, right?
It is, yeah. Then I decided I wanted pinks, reds, and oranges for the cornerstones. But you don't have to use only one fabric for cornerstones. Right. They're similar. So they communicate the same idea even though they're done scrappy.
Fun, fun, fun. All right, let's look at the next one.
I thought maybe it would be interesting to limit the palette and make some stars that way with sashing. So here I just did sort of
beautiful.
Just an autumn
Very
palette.
autumn, yes.
But you know, hot pink, it's a red.
Isn't
it's a form of red.
That is a surprise.
But in the overall picture, you know, it's going to be bigger, but I ran out of this fabric, so I have to find something similar to continue.
Oh, I know that feeling. My very, very, very first quilt, I ran out of sashing, and I have one sashing in one color going vertically and a whole different going the opposite way.
But you know what? If you're making scrappy quilts, it doesn't matter if you run out.
Yeah.
Again, same idea, just a limited palette. Did a little 3-block table runner.
Yeah, so
Super.
if your favorite colors are yellow and blue, or if you're trying to make maybe a room to coordinate, then you've just got a bunch of these blocks and you can do that.
And so, like the blues are quite different from each other, and the yellows as well, and you can do that in a scrappy quilt. Here we have more blue-green, bright blue, sky blue.
Well, and I see mustardy yellows and bright yellows. They're all working together.
Exactly. Clashing. Embrace the clash.
Embrace the clash. I love that. I'm going to remember that.
I thought maybe I should branch out from just plain stars, and so this is something that I messed around with, where I have the star in the middle and then just partial stars around it. And then I kind of did the same idea of a false border with darker units along
nice. Yeah,
the sides.
That border happens because of the contrast of the value.
Yeah, I think this might become a giant quilt with this as the block.
As like a medallion or something?
Maybe, we'll see.
All right, cool.
And then I wanted to do something Christmassy. I love Christmas quilts, and so here I decided I'd put the star in the middle, but then I floated it with some
Just squares.
just plain 2.5-inch squares. So one round of light neutrals, and then a round of reds, and then partial.
And then finished the star quars.
Yes.
For the,
So again, this is going to become a giant quilt, I think.
yay.
Very entertaining
All
way to
right.
sew.
And the last one?
This one,
Wow.
I decided, they don't really have to become stars. They could just stand on their own.
Look at that.
So, we should maybe show it so they can see the kitties.
All right. Oh, yeah. Okay. So let's do that.
There you go.
Suddenly, yeah,
So-
our producer, Shelley, who's a cat lover, she came over and says, oh, you made a cat quilt. Well, look carefully, everybody. It is.
I really thought maybe they were flowers or something, tulips, but
Tulips would
lots of
work.
people see kitties in windows. So it's just one star core unit, and then I tied it together with a really electric yellow. I love this color, and I think it does the quilt the favor of distracting from all the chaos of the star quars.
Sure. Grab the top. Let's just do a quick pull it out here, because I think this is going to look glorious if we just take a moment to show that. Isn't that fun?
So
And I love this striped border that you chose.
thank you. You are letting the fabric do the work. when you do.
And talk about that, because that's one of your things, letting the fabric do the work versus the complexity of the block.
Yes, my quilts feature simple piecing. You can make a dynamite quilt with simple piecing if you let the fabric do the work. I encourage people to set aside their fear. It's only fabric. And if you make something ugly, the world will keep on turning.
It will, yeah, you just have to play.
Play, absolutely.
Well, Miss Diane, the fabric bandit, you have stolen my heart, okay? I hope that she has stolen yours. Tell us your website.
Stashbandit.net.
Of course it is. Stashbandit.net, and you teach.
I do. I love to visit quilt guilds. I love teaching classes in person and online. And it's been a pleasure to be here.
It's been great having you. Go Nebraska, go Big Red, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Everyone, thank you so much for being with us today. And you know what we say? It's a new day every day.
Don't go anywhere. You don't want to miss the after set.
Diane, who let the dogs out? Because we're going to talk about dogs. Tell us about, what is a dog?
A dog is a quilt that just didn't turn out quite the way you had hoped.
Had
And
all this hope and dream coming, and it just didn't make it.
didn't make it. But I think everybody has them. And I think I have learned that I gain so much more when a quilt doesn't go as planned. I learn so much more than I do on a quilt that goes just swimmingly.
I tell people not every quilt can be a home run. You hit the ball, you go to bat. You know, you might hit the ball, you might not hit the ball, but you just keep playing the game.
That's exactly right.
All right, so I brought a dog, and you brought dogs. So we're kind of like exposing our souls here, letting people see things that didn't quite turn out. You laughed at me because you said, well, at least, Ricky, you finished yours. I did finish this one, and it actually kind of popped out. I got to turn it this direction. It popped out while I was reorganizing my studio recently, and I even forgot that I made it, all right? Now, the crazy thing is, I took a picture of this and posted it on social media, and the picture didn't look so bad. It turned out pretty good in the picture. But when I look at this, I look at the workmanship of my stitches on the applique. I look at this horrible stitching that I did around. So for me, the dog ended up being more about the finish and the workmanship. I'm not proud of this. This is not where I am. It's not, it's not even like when I was really a beginner. This was when I was kind of doing things. I like the overall design, but I didn't like the finish. I didn't even like the finish that I did on the binding, which is this kind of glittery, weird top-stitched thing, which functions, but I just don't like it. So this is the dog that I brought today.
I hate to tell you this, but my dogs are going to knock your dogs down.
We will see. Let's just see how
I think my dogs are quite a lot worse.
Okay, all right.
This is a dog that I made in an art quilt class, and I had this idea of doing this
an
vintage
art quilt class?
Yeah, this vintage tablecloth. I thought it was such a great idea. And my triad.
How long ago was this?
This was in probably 2004.
Do you think you've grown since then?
I hope so.
Oh my. Well, here's the thing. It has some lovely redeeming values to it.
And what would that be?
Well, I like the overall color scheme. So, see, I can always find something good to say. I also like that like your red is not really red and your yellow is kind of a toned down yellow. So there's a coordination of visual color on this. I am looking at the quilting on it, and I have to say it compares with mine over here.
All right,
All
dog
right.
number one
All
down.
right, number one.
This is my favorite little block that we talked about earlier that I've done a bunch of different things
Can I
with.
open this up?
Sure.
You mind?
I was figuring out how to make scrappy little windmills work together.
Okay.
And I think the problem with this piece is that there isn't any glue. There's nothing that brings it together. There's no common denominator, as you said earlier. The blocks aren't distinct enough because it's so scrappy. The sashing is too meek.
Okay, I do
perhaps.
think the sashing does not tie it together. I will agree with that, but I overall like the quilt. So, and I think that's probably what's going to keep happening with a lot of us. We may find things that we don't like, but other people could find things that they do like.
Maybe so.
And I think this is charming, beautiful. I would finish it up and make a baby quilt out of it. I mean,
Okay.
it's fine. It's
Well,
fine
then
and dandy.
My worst dog is the last
the-
quilt. So I was in.
What is this?
I took a class, and now this is not a reflection on poor Pamela
No,
Allen.
what is
Pamela
this?
Allen was
I
teaching.
know Pamela Allen.
She's a wonderful art quilter, and she was teaching a class in Houston, and I wanted to. She puts these funky
What?
eyes on her quilts.
Oh, there's a face in there.
And then this is supposed to be a combination of hair, or it could be a weeping
It's
willow.
Medusa. What are you talking hair?
And then I, for some reason, thought this might be a nice diversion.
Okay,
But
this one I think is a lovely art piece that it belongs in sophisticated, like MoMA or someplace.
Yeah, well,
Because it's beyond my understanding,
There
and
you
that's
go.
typically what modern art does. I love this, though. I love these
You can
big
always
stitches.
find something,
That's
right?
what I'm saying.
So-
always find something good.
maybe my lesson was that I couldn't be Pamela Allen. I had to find my own voice.
Yeah, my favorite thing about this quilt is the pen in the
That's a sign of she gave up.
That is
It's
fabulous.
done.
Oh, well, here's the thing. The purpose of us even chatting about this is to say we all go down different journeys and we have ideas that we think are good and maybe they don't turn out, but it doesn't stop us. We learn something from it, and I think that's the important thing.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much for being willing to bring the dogs,
Of
all right,
course.
and teach us a little bit about that. It's been
My
fun.
pleasure.
Thank
My
you.
pleasure.